Jason's going to stay on as moderator. We've now heard from those who are going to oversee the Data Act. Next up are the gentlemen that they will be overseeing. We're very excited to welcome David Lebryk, the Fiscal Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Dave Mader, the Controller of OMB, those who are responsible under the law for this transformation from documents into data. To introduce them is our panel sponsor, PwC, represented by Principal Don McCrory. And Jason Miller is going to stay on and continue to moderate. Please welcome our panel.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Don McCrory with PwC, and welcome to the Data Transparency Coalition, and thank you to Mr. Mader and Mr. Lebryk for being here to talk about implementation of the Data Act. Just a couple of things I wanted to bring up thinking about the Data Act as I was, sort of driving in this morning. What was I going to say this morning to you all? And I was thinking about, in 1987, I was a junior accountant in a federal agency preparing SF-133s. And at the time, it was a sort of a change agent that came up. We got a PC in the office. And as part of getting that PC in the office, we were now going to prepare our SF-133 rather than giving it to the secretary to type. We were going to put it on a 5¼ inch floppy disk drive, and we would be able to automate that, and then we would send over another junior accountant who would run it over to the Treasury Department so they could combine all these into a computer's program and then have a consolidated SF-133. And that was sort of life-changing at that time. We had a computer, it's kind of cool. And then I thought about this morning, I looked on my smartphone, a couple of statistics I brought up. In January 2014, more people accessed the internet by a mobile device than they did over a laptop or a PC. First time ever, in January 2014. More people had done that. By 2017, there will be 3 billion smartphones or tablets used in the world. 3 billion in 2.5 years. The average individual in the Western Hemisphere will have 3 devices at their access by 2017, usually a laptop, a smartphone, and a tablet. Approximately 57% of the people now say they use either a personal tablet or a smartphone to access corporate data to do their work mobily. So if you think about in 27 years what occurred then to what we're talking about now, thinking 27 years into the future, where's it going to be? It's kind of exciting to think about. So the Data Act is sort of a backstop to where we're at. I think we're going to talk about compliance and getting the law right and having it audited and the data, but this is beyond what we're thinking about relative to compliance. It's really a sea change in the way that data is going to be managed and moved around the world and how people are going to manage this or want this information. So I think we're just on the cusp of a very exciting opportunity. Look forward to hearing from our speakers. Thank the Hudson and the DTC for this program, and I'll turn it over to Jason to start the program. Thank you.
All right, in the radio world, this is called a 2 for Tuesday. Thank you. Only one radio joke per panel, I know. I don't have any awesome radio facts this time around, but I will talk about the ground rules. You know them. They're going to get a little more time. They're more important. No, I mean, did I say that out loud? They're important people. So we're going to get a little more time, less of them, and then we'll get to your questions. So again, I'll walk around. Quick context. I was fortunate enough also to go to the Data Act Town Hall meeting last Friday. It was a nice precursor to the event. I got to learn a little bit more. A couple things what we know, right? And they're going to get into this a little bit. Treasury published on Friday a request for information on the best data exchange standards within federal agencies with the public. I'm sure a lot of people in this audience will be responding to that RFI soon. And again, we'll go back to the growing refrain of dump dones that may come through with those RFI comments eventually. I think that was one interesting aspect. Another one, creating an implementation roadmap for the Data Act. That's what OMB and Treasury are working on. 12 to 36 months, that's what they're heading down. So I'm sure Mr. Mader will hit upon that a little bit. And then we also learned, I thought this was the most fascinating piece, no matter what you do with RFIs, with town hall meetings, the real goal is consistent and real conversations with the people that matter. And that is, of course, agencies, good government groups, the general public, academics, anybody else, and of course, oversight committee, most importantly, about what this means, how this will work. And I think that is one of the key lessons that I heard time and again at the town hall about why the Recovery Act worked. I mean, even OMB Deputy Director Beth Colbert talked about the importance of the Recovery Act and the oversight and the collaboration that went into it. So I guess in the end, what I heard from Friday was two main goals for the Data Act: transform the government, how the government meets its mission by giving agencies the ability to make better data-driven decisions, and, of course, give the public access to more data on how the government spends its money. So, with that little bit of context, I will turn it over to the Dave and Dave show, starting with Dave Mader, the controller of OMB. Oh, you're going to start with Mr. Yeah. Oh, they didn't tell me this. Take it away.
Yes, thank you. It's good to see Hudson's 450 best friends in one place. It's really nice to have this session. I thought what I would do is a couple things, which is first talk about the importance of the initiative. Secondly, talk a little bit about some of the principles on how we're going to be moving forward, then turn it over to Dave to talk a little bit more about the implementation and the details about how we're proceeding. This is undoubtedly a really important piece of legislation and has the potential to really be very transformational. I think you've heard from many of the speakers this morning about how important data is, and when you look across the best-run organizations, there's a high correlation between good access to data and strong performance. And while there's a very admirable goal within the Data Act to increase transparency to the public at large, and there's a lot of very good reasons for that, innovation, informed citizenry, and a lot of other really important pieces to that, at the end of the day, for the federal agencies, in order for this not to be just a compliance effort, actually to be meaningful, it's about the CFO community and the government agencies having better access to data to make sure they understand the decisions that they're making and the impact of those decisions. And so as Dave and I have gone out and spoken into the community, and we've been really hard at work going out and trying to make the case about why this is so important, we've heard repeatedly from the federal agencies that they do want to have access to better data. They want to be able to make better informed decisions. They want the CFO function to be able to operate more effectively within their organizations. And so for us as an executive branch to be moving forward, having that kind of mindset is going to be critical to achieving those other goals about transparency to the public, ability to have innovation in the world at large, and have a better informed citizenry. No question that there's a lot of hard work ahead of us in this process. I think you've heard this from the speakers this morning, that this is not an easy challenge. The federal government's a very large entity. And we also know that our data resides in a number of places. There are procurement systems, there are grant systems, there are accounting systems, and our ability to have those systems speak and talk to one another and actually extract data, meaningful data, is not easy. And so it's going to take a lot of hard work to be moving the communities forward and getting at that. I think some of the underlying principles I would talk about, which are really important and have come up, is this really has to be a data-centric effort. And it has to be a data-centric effort, and the agencies need to own the data and use the data. It can't be a systems effort. And that's how we often in the past have approached these kinds of things in government, build a large system. I thought the commentator earlier who mentioned the ability of very large, expensive scaled systems and the ability to actually look at it differently, I think was a comment right on the mark. That there are ways to do this that are more efficient and actually ultimately more effective in terms of our ability to get at data. So I think that the data-centric is critical, and that leads to one of the comments about getting the data exchange standards that we need are so very important. The questions around mapping data and extracting data from organizations is important. The notion about incremental, and that is that as we move along, not every agency is going to be in the same place. And so there are some who are further along than others. And so we need to make sure that we're making measured progress as we're going through the implementation and making data available as it is available as best that we can. It has to be reusable. And that is that we have to make sure that we make maximum usage of existing investments and existing processes. You'll hear later in the day today about some of the work that's being done between the procurement and the grants community. Really exciting work of them sitting down and sort of thinking, we've been thinking about some of these questions for a number of years now. This is now an opportunity, the Data Act provides an opportunity to start to really advance that thinking that's been going on. And I think it's very promising. It has to be collaborative. Sessions like this are enormously important. Making sure that we're informing Congress, making sure that we're reaching out to different communities, making sure that we're hearing from them. States and localities are an important constituency in this process because they have a lot of access or use of federal funds, the public at large. I thought there was a very interesting comment earlier about, about how we present the data. And one of the things, we've done a little bit of research on this, and it turns out that, there are a variety of kinds of users of federal data. There are those who just want us to provide them data, and that is to, in some ways, shape the information that we're providing them. There are those who want to access federal data, who want to use the tools that we provide to them to actually get insights into that data. And there are those who just simply want raw data. And they just simply want to have access to government information, and they will do their own analysis. They will use that information for innovation or however they want to use it. I think as we're going forward, it's important that we're conscious of all three of those in terms of how we use the data and how we present it to the public at large. And then finally, we have to be iterative and agile. And that is that we have to try some small-scale projects and pilots to see how they work, and then try, as we have successes, and we will have failures in those processes, to see exactly what's the best way to proceed longer term, and to move on from that direction. I didn't mention that the Act puts a lot of responsibility squarely on the shoulders of OMB and Treasury, and we're taking that responsibility very seriously. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Dave to talk about how we've actually looked at the effort and how we're proceeding with the actual implementation piece.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everybody. So I guess back in the late winter, I was sort of contemplating coming back into government service, and some of you know that I probably spent more than a couple of decades at the IRS, who's a large collector and user of data. And one of the motivations for coming to OMB was the ability to actually be engaged in this initiative. And the other, I think, important thing was the ability to work with Dave Lebryk, because Dave and I had known each other and worked together quite closely over many, many years in the Treasury Department. And when I think about the Data Act, I think about a journey. And I think some of the speakers before us have talked about sort of the progression going back to 2008, 2009, and perhaps even beyond that. And when I think about the journey and I think about what we've accomplished with USA spending, and yes, we can talk about things that could work better, but I think we've learned an awful lot from putting up that website, from working with the agencies, with working with the Congress. And I think that the passage of the Data Act back a few months ago is just a progression in where this country is going. And I think Nick did a really nice job in his introduction to talk about basically where the world is going. And I'm not quite sure that the U.S. is actually leading at this point based on some of the facts that Nick talked about. I think the Data Act is an opportunity for us to sort of reemerge as the leader with regard to open government and citizen services, because at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. It's us providing data, not only, as Dave mentioned, to the agencies and the departments who have to deliver those services, but to have citizens understand exactly what the value of their tax dollar is to them and to the country at large. Years ago, I heard a comment made about vision, and I do think we have a vision, but what this individual told me is, Dave, a vision without a plan is a nightmare. and I do believe that before I joined OMB in early June, planning had already begun between OMB on how we're going to move forward in implementing this act. I also, I think, commented on Friday at the town hall meeting that if this were easy, somebody had done this before. This is going to be challenging, but it is quite doable. And what we have done between Treasury and OMB over the last 2.5, 3 months now is, I think, putting together a construct that we can use to manage this process in a very iterative way. And as Dave mentioned, this is not sort of the Big Bang theory, that this is going to be a very iterative approach. We're going to rely on lessons learned, and we're also going to look at some opportunities to experiment, because what, as Dave mentioned, we don't want to do, nor does anybody have the resources, to build the world's biggest database. And we believe that technology and data analytics is going to allow us to create a very innovative approach to how to implement the next iteration of spending that's transparent to taxpayers. So we've created a steering committee between Dave and myself and our respective teams. Our teams are meeting on a daily basis. Dave and I probably meet or talk on the phone about the Data Act at probably 4 out of 5 days a week. We've also created a advisory committee, and one of the speakers mentioned the need to sort of integrate the work that has been done over the years, whether it's in the grants community or in the acquisition community or in the CFO Council. How do you bring all of these stakeholders and how do you bring all of these disparate data sources together in one place? And that's really the key to the implementation of the Data Act. It's to be able to integrate what already exists. And people go, well, gee, we have, Dave, all these stovepipes. Well, I mean, our introduction to this was about the advances of technology over the last 20 plus years. Well, you know what? 20 years ago, we built stovepipe systems. We can't afford to build new systems, but what we can do with the use of data is to identify the data elements in those different stovepipes and bring them together in a new way that will allow the transparency not only for citizens, but will give managers at the federal level the opportunity to look at data in a way they've never looked at before and make better decisions so that the mission that we're delivering really is meeting the needs of citizens. So we've created the steering committee, which is composed of representatives from each of the CXO councils. So we have representatives from the grants community, from the acquisition community, from the CFO community. And what we basically have laid out between Treasury and OMB, because we do have the responsibility for the implementation, is a division of responsibility on the key components. And there are 3 that I think are extremely important right now. And one is the definition of data elements. And that responsibility is being led by OMB. The second, equally important, is the source of the data. And we've talked about, where this data resides in different stovepipe databases and how do we identify those data elements that eventually we want to display, and then how do we tag it, how do we bring it together in a seamless way. And then the final is how do we publish the data? And we've all talked about the visualization, and I think that as we continue to iterate our idea of how to visualize the next version of USA spending, it can look very different than perhaps it looks today. And I think a couple of speakers have mentioned, the fact that this is going to be a multi-year journey. And what we want to do is try some things, get some feedback. And Dave mentioned the need for stakeholders. And it's stakeholders not only across the federal bureaucracy, but I think as important, or perhaps even more important, with the stakeholders, citizens, good government groups, contractors, vendors. We all have a stake in how this is going to be successfully iterated. So we started our first town hall meeting last Friday. We certainly appreciate Hudson's pulling this group together. What we're going to be looking for is a protocol that basically engages this broad stakeholder community on a very continuous basis. We haven't figured out exactly yet how we're going to do that, but our commitment to you today is that we're going to have this active engagement because we all together can come up with the implementation of the vision that we all share. Thank you.
All right, so I heard a couple things. Patience, it's going to be a multi-year journey. Data-centric is key, not a system-centric approach. And pilots, lots of pilots. So I'm going to come to the audience in just a quick second, but here's the first question of the day from the moderator's privilege. Let me start with Treasury Dave versus OMB Dave. You talk about the data-centric approach. Obviously with FFATA, that was more of a, I think you would agree, I would hope, a system-centric approach. How do you deal with that data-centric approach this time around? Is it a matter of pulling the data or what?
I think you heard one of the earlier commentators talk about mapping and the ability to, some promising ways to sort of have a common language. You do have to set some of the standards there as it relates to how you define things. But in large measure, what you're finding right now is this information does reside in systems. It's just described differently in the different systems. And so, you do have underlying data quality issues, and there's no question that we have to continue to be focused on that. But some of it also is just your ability to find the information and map it correctly to the right place. And I think those are some of the pilots that we have in mind are taking a look at that, about how practical and how feasible that is on a broader scale. I do think also, going back to some of the earlier efforts that have been underway, the Data Act is a broader view of federal spending than has been in the past. And so, we have situations and circumstances right now where someone says, look, Congress appropriated $100 million for something, and a contract was let for $70 million, but a payment just went out on the program for only $30 million. Or which of those things is right? Well, it turns out all three of them are right. It's just how you describe it. And I think when we talk about kind of a 360 view of federal spending, it's about making sure you understand the distinctions among those three things, and having the ability to have better insights into that. So our longer term vision is about how do you do a good job of articulating that and visualizing that for the users of financial.
All right. So I'm going to come to the audience. We got questions yet? Or remember, I get paid to do questions, so I can ask questions all day. No one yet? There we go, in the back. There we go. We have a microphone back there. Thank you.
I'm Clint Brass from the Congressional Research Service, agency that supports Congress. I have found it quite difficult in the past to try to look under the hood and monitor what's going on with financial management improvements and these sorts of efforts. Have you talked about and determined what your strategy will be for letting folks know outside the executive branch what your main efforts are? How frequently will you let them know? What kind of level of detail, et cetera, so that stakeholders can monitor what's going on?
I think two points to make, and then I'm sure Dave has a view as well. I mean, I think in the prior panel we heard from representatives from the Congress about, they're interested in the progress, and we have begun to engage in periodic briefings, and I would suspect over time that those will continue. I also, as I mentioned, we're committed to figure out a frequent way of engaging stakeholders. I wish I could tell you we have that plan in place. We don't. But we recognize that there's a lot of interest not only within the executive branch, but the legislative branch, as well as stakeholders across a various spectrum of industries. So we're going to figure out a way to do that, and when we do, we're going to actively engage people.
It's clearly one of the work streams that we have within the effort as we've mapped out kind of the appropriate way to implement. And there are a number of ways to do those kinds of things, and some have things like town halls are good, but they're hard to arrange, and they may not actually capture everyone. And so thinking more through electronically how we engage people is important. We need to continue to do forums like this where we're out speaking about what we're doing. As Dave points out, congressional interest is there, and we need to be continuing to do that as well. So I think you're right. There's we clearly have this as a stream of something we have to get at, and we've got some thoughts on it that I think we'll be seeing some more on that shortly.
All right, I got a question back here. Then I'll come to the front. I saw you.
It's Alex Howard, Tech Republic. One of the issues that's come up recently with Recovery Act, recovery.gov, is around identifiers, and the government needed to pay for DUNS numbers. Is there any consideration at OMB or Treasury about creating a public system for identifiers for business so that the United States government is no longer in the position of paying the private sector to identify who's paying who?
I don't know whether Nick mentioned this in his comments, but the White House recently released a digital services playbook, and one of the best practices that they've laid out is open source and non-proprietary standards. I know in Treasury, for example, we have an initiative underway to, in the financial services industry, which is the legal entity identifier, which is a non-proprietary standard. It's been used worldwide. I think that's something that, when we're looking at these kinds of things, we have to consider whether that's appropriate for the kinds of stuff that we're doing today.
All right, another question over here.
Eric Brenner, representing some of the state governments. I think both of you understand the difference between the stakeholders and the users, and it's just after having stepped in to the town hall last week and today, the bulk of the people who show up with these stakeholders are either concerned about reporting the federal data from the agency standpoint, private sector folks who can make money off it, or the purist Sunlight, ISA folks that just on principle want it out there. It's really going to be tough for you to access the people that are going to use the data. They care about it. It's never the top priority, though. So just to reiterate what I think you both recognize as this goes on, local governments, nonprofits, individuals, just to keep making the effort to pull them in to things like this. And no immediate recommendation on how to do it. But as you look around the room, there'll be very, very few people here today who really represent the data user community at the front end. So I really appreciate the comments and the effort you're making, and just want to urge you to keep thinking creatively as this goes along.
Yeah, I think, you heard Nick Sinai this morning, talk about how you have to have a relentless focus on the users, and that's an engagement with communities. And as we've laid out our work plan, that's very much a critical element in it.
Yeah, and I think the other point is to that, when you think about the services, a lot of the services that are provided through federal funding are actually executed through state and local and not-for-profit. So, being able to have them understand what we're trying to accomplish and taking their needs into consideration, I think goes back to my earlier point. I mean, it's about providing citizens the services regardless of the channel that those services are used to get those services out to citizens.
And I just imagine, just from the fact that you guys are getting out, this is not going to be a short-term, let's get out, let's talk to people. It's going to be a consistent way to get out, not just events like this, and of course on Federal News Radio 1500 AM, but also on other things like, thank you, also other things like blogs, wikis, interact sites, stuff like that. I imagine that's part of it.
Sure, there was a reference earlier to the data jam, and I think Nick mentioned about data Lollapaloozas, and I think we're going to have a poetry jam a little bit later. We're going to do that as well.
All right, one more question.
Hi, I'm Adam Glass. I'm representing myself. In addressing the thing about involving stakeholders and experts outside the government, obviously a lot of the knowledge on technology, a lot of the knowledge on standards is outside the government. Have you considered something that goes beyond the round table, more along the lines of the processes of a voluntary standards consensus body as recommended under OMB Circular A119? I mean, obviously these are not voluntary standards because they are, mandated by statute. But in my experience in working with the process under which the legal entity identifier and some other standards related to financial regulation were developed, it seems like that process is already a built-in process where you have regular kind of working group level involvement of these people that are standards experts as well as from the many different fields. So just asking if you have considered that, or would you consider it?
I think that's a good suggestion, and I think as the previous panel mentioned, I mean, we have pretty broad latitude under the statute. It's not like it was so precisely defined. So I think at this point, getting more of that kind of input and suggestions is going to help us in deciding, how do we, how are we going to create all of these standards? We know what we can do within the federal bureaucracy, but, how do we reach the non-federal stakeholders?
All right, we got one other in the back.
I'm Mike Wood, former director of the Recovery Board, executive director. Now I'm working for CGI as an IT consultant. One quick question. I like the concept of sort of continuing to get public input and so forth. Have you thought about, we worked with the National Academy of Public Administration. We actually ran 2 open forums with them, one on transparency early on and one on accountability later on. The advantage of that was you sort of had a third-party group collecting information for the government. They're a distinguished group of former government employees, so they know something about this. And it opened it up for comments nationally. The town hall, I attended the town hall. It was a great meeting. I enjoyed it. But, you know, if you do things in Washington, you're sort of in the beltway. If you do things on the web and do it in an open format, you can really collect a lot of data very quickly. We ran it for about a week. It was very effective. It doesn't have to be NAPA, it could be another group, but I think that's a good idea to look at those type of techniques. And I don't know if you've thought about that yet.
As a Napa fellow, I endorse that. But I also don't think we want to be, you know, have exclusivity to any one group. So I think there's lots of opportunities to partner with, you know, not-for-profits who have an interest in this area.
We got time for one more. Is that a statement? Yes. Because she was already standing, and you have to give her, you know.
I was not standing, but good morning, Angela Ray, Grove House Consulting. Apologies for being late. You may have answered this. I was caught up in the red line debacle. 2 hours from Bethesda. So my question to you, or not a question, but an idea to keep in mind as you're going forward. We had the conversations last week about data transparency in the financial sector. One of the problems we have in implementation at the federal level is marrying together that program data with the financial data. How did we do? Was it worth the money we spent? So my comment to you is, as we're looking at this, to ensure that there might be ways that we can push that data out, not just from a financial statement perspective, but also from a program management perspective, so that we can marry together are we doing the public interest at the right price? Are we getting the benefit out that we want? So just to keep that in mind as we're going through, not just financial statements, but financial statements in light of the greater goal. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Comments, last comments? Quick clap. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to you guys. Hudson?
Thank you to Treasury and OMB. We are much appreciate Treasury and OMB joining us. We will return our focus to the Data Act later this afternoon when Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General of the United States, will come to give his thoughts on how the Data Act might lead to federal accountability. Next, however, we are going to shift gears to open data in financial regulation. On the stage at 11, we're going to welcome Congressman Patrick McHenry. So be back for that, but in the meantime, go get coffee. Thank you.